Tonight, we're going to have Ivo and Bonnie in conversation. Mostly, they're just going to be allowing us to have a sort of insight into how they think together and how we might also notice how they're thinking together as a form of practice also in translating the words and the theories and the ideas from the essay into something that we can start thinking about how it might enter into the world and enter into the social imaginary, which is one of the key terms that Ivo uses in the essay. So brief bio for both of them. So Ivo is, as I said, a colleague at Perspectiva of mine. He is in charge of the praxis strand of our work, which means he also helps develop the courses that we're creating. And he has a wide variety of past lives, which include working on greenhouses. And if you read the first half of the essay, you'll get deeper insight into his personal background. He's also a coach and is an ordained Sodo Zen Buddhist. Is that right, Ivo? Did I say that correctly?
Yeah.
So there's a lot more that he can say about himself, but I will leave that to further conversations. And then Bonnie, we're excited also to have her join us here. She is running the pop-up school, and I think many of you have come from the pop-up school to us tonight. So that's great. And she's a philosopher and author. She's an insight guide. And she was also a professor in the MA in Consciousness Studies and Transpersonal Psychology at the Graduate Institute. So I think I will just allow you two to introduce what you're going to be doing tonight. And as we go along, feel free to enter any questions you have into the chat box. I think also Bonnie will describe this, but I think she also wants you to enter whatever you're noticing as well as we go along, and to think through not just sort of very technical questions, although those are also welcome, but I think specifically how you're experiencing the conversation is something that we want to sort of elicit from in the chat box tonight. So welcome, and I'll let you two take over from here.
Lee.
Thanks, Lee. So I guess I'm going first. We tossed a coin, I was lost. This is really a great opportunity for myself and Ivo, because we've been dialoguing quite regularly now for, I would say, a year. And the essay has a lot of common threads in it between us. But what I would like to do is invite the audience into a certain type of relationship to this conversation. And that is, if you're on this call today, you are probably someone who watches a lot of videos or has read a lot about this notion of time between worlds and the need to escape the constraints of our underlying social imaginary. We'll be talking about that, but also to use our minds in a new way. And so what I would like you to do is not only listen to the concepts and the content, but notice that this conversation is an instance of itself. We can't go to the past. We can't just go to, like, take the playbook from the axial age and try to reproduce that in our time. We need to think about these things, think about a historical period, think about our past, and simultaneously create a new playbook. And this is what Ivo and I spend all our time, not all our time, we also enjoy each other, but most of our work is trying to do these two things. So, and basically I wrote down that I want you to notice what it's like to witness people trying to think our way out of our own way of thinking. We're trying to think our way out of our own way of thinking. And what moves do you notice? Where do you see the struggles? Where do you see maybe some novel ways of using language? Notice how, and Ivo does this perfectly in his essay. He goes, he suspects that there's something about his personal journey that has something to do with the larger collective today. And this is what we want you to notice, is this how we are talking about this transformation, simultaneously trying to catch ourselves in limiting mental models and move out of that. And I think that if you read the essay, you'll see that happening in the essay itself. But this opportunity to try to hone your skills in noticing some of these dynamics. So welcome everyone, and Ivo.
Yeah, welcome. Yeah, thanks for that intro and that invitation. And I'm happy you bring that up to see what is going on in the moment. And because part of writing an essay is quite frustrating in some respect, because you feel you're talking about it. And the essay actually came out of me thinking about practices and really a lot of first person experiences, and out of an analysis of what we call the meta crisis, the poly crisis, how it is entangled, how do our mental models propagate reality, social reality, and our enculturation. And then at some point, Jonathan Rowson, this was all for the courses, that was my thinking, and Jonathan Rowson asked me to write an essay, and I was like, okay. and then I had to start talking about it, which was it's good to do, but it's also really frustrating, because it's like reading the menu and not getting the food, let's say. So so I think it's a really good piece of foundation here for this talk. And so where do we kick off? I think, Bonnie, I've gotten a few reactions from people, and I'm quite interested and amazed by how different what stood out for them. What was salient in the essay. So I was just wondering about what it was for you actually that you picked up on.
Well, there's a lot, but I think what drew me in from the beginning, when I really started to meld with the essay, was I was imagining you as a young person, and I had this question, like, so imagine you as a young person, and you're going through some kind of initiation rite, let's say. And so the first thing I realized was that I was thinking about a lot of people that I know who have similar stories. I mean, they're not the same story because they're very nonlinear. Many of our journeys have been so unconventional. But it was this question of what is it about this time between individual stages, let's say, of your life, or phases. I don't want to use stages like developmental stage theory. I want to use the term phase, like Zach Stein says. So when you're in between phases of your life's journey, I was noticing that that's like a society being in between worlds. And so I was thinking of how I was thinking about using that as a template, like what kind of initiation should the society have, or what kind of, like, is that really a crisis when people have unconventional childhoods or young adulthoods? So this is what was happening for me, like to think about the choice points, let's say, in your life, and how do they come to you? Like, how does choice come to you? You have this quote by Zach Stein that says every choice counts. And so I thought we could talk about, like, if you reflect on what is it about the human journey that enabled you to make choices, or did you feel like they just made themselves, and to use that as like a running metaphor for what might be possible at the social scale.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, the writing it, the autobiographical part, if you go to the essays, for those who haven't read it, I go quite a bit into my developmental history, and also realizing or finding memories that the socialization, I was thinking about it today, and I actually thought, oh, kids just experienced gaslighting by their parents and culture. But so the process of socialization was pretty conscious for some odd reason, and I remember quite clearly still setting the dials, let's say, on my personality you know, a little less extroversion. And this was in reaction to feedback that I would get from my peers, for example. And again, this was quite young. And, you know, yeah, these, like I said, all the little tweaks, maybe the big five or something like that, you know, I was like consciously setting them, doing the settings to fitting in. And so a part of me, I felt like I was in two consciousnesses. One was just the regular first person, and the other one was spent in a witnessing state for some reason, like that also from a young age realized at some point, I think it must have been 10 years old or something. And I realized I was born in Holland and I was thinking in Dutch, and it kind of hit me. And I was like, oh, wait, this is just, this is foreign in some ways. This can't be natural because I learned Dutch. So something has kind of inserted itself into my being. And there was also from the start quite a fascination with the fact that anything at all was going on, you know, something rather than nothing, as philosophers sometimes say. So yeah, the socialization process that I described, my socialization process, and actually let's say the failures of it to some extent, due to going into my teenage years, the second half, you know, now finally reading, discovering spiritual books, and then becoming like a DIY practitioner of consciousness, introspection, and having those kinds of effects, and yeah, not following the script really. So that was part of the experience growing up. And I say in the essay, just to finish the point, it's like, I think it's Jesus. I tried to find the source of the quote, but he talks about being in the world but not of it. And this is something that he would instruct his disciples to be like, okay, you're in the world, but don't get too involved in its structure, in its drama, in, you know, pressures on the way to be, and pre-given norms. And so yeah, I found myself being in the world but not of it. That was the dominant feeling, like coming without the proper human software installed, which I think was funny for someone with the last name Mensch, which means human in Dutch.
You know, what that makes me think of is, so we have this phenomenon where people at, I think at an earlier and earlier age are aware of, okay, so I'll put it this way. So Heidegger had this concept of thrownness, right? You're thrown into the world. You, as a young person, you're conditioned, but not really because you listen to what people say, is that you're young and you go through life, even as a toddler, you want to know, how does the world work? And so what you have are hunches. Like you have a hunch that if I pull on this, then that will move that. You have a hunch about causality. You have a hunch about the theory of mind of other people's. You have a hunch about what's happening in your interior and how does that manifest the exterior. And so for you, this process becomes, you become aware of some of this early on. If you're saying, well, I'll dial that back, or that you have some kind of control over it or choice points over it. But in general, like this is what's always been happening, but what's happening more and more recently, in my opinion, working with young adults for a long period of time, is that they tell these stories like that when they were 7 or when they were 10, the constructed, or I related to it, like I thought adults were pretending. And then I thought, well, when I get old enough, they will let me in on it. They're just pretending because I'm a kid. And then I would like go, oh my God, they don't even know they're pretending, you know? But for me, what happened was, so there was some part of that in the family relationships, but I grew up, 12 years at Catholic school, and I liked the rituals. I didn't question them much. I went to mass with my boyfriend all through high school. But the day I graduated, because it was a Catholic school, private Catholic school, we graduated in the cathedral, and it was high mass. And they like brought the monstrance down, which I'd seen many, many times. And all of a sudden, I had all the meaning that had ever been wrapped into it was gone. And I was like, holy shit, what the, like literally peeled away. Like there's this phenomenon Oliver Sacks talks about, where people come home and they open from work and they open the door to their flat, and they are convinced that someone has stolen their everything and replaced it with an exact duplicate, because they lose the sense of familiarity. There's no longer meaning attached to it. And I just saw this thing as like this weird pagan ritual, and it was like a switch. And so my question for you, we're using the individual, like can this happen to a society? Like, can a society all of a sudden be reflexively aware of itself? That's one question. So I want you to talk about the social imaginary, like what you think is possible. But then on the other hand, this is tricky, because if a society is reflexively aware of its social imaginary, can it in fact create another one? Yeah. So,
right.
And there's that pickle in your own individual journey. You start to see through things, and then do you just do without? Like, what happens then?
That's a great question, and to again bring it back to the personal, where I grew up, they have a pretty like crazy work ethic, in that part of Holland, and so the background was Protestant, and the funny thing was that when I grew up, I had to participate in this work ethic. But, and this is actually a really good distinction between like what is culture and what is the social imaginary, because culture really is just the practices, right? And the practices were just like the real, like the work. You have to work, and really no explanation was really given. I'm like, why do you have to work so hard? And but the imaginary basically signals like why the practices are meaningful, right? And as you know, the history of capitalism and the Protestant notion of predestination, that kind of like success in worldly life, if you work hard, that was kind of like signaling that your ticket to heaven was kind of your place in heaven was secured. But I grew up in a pretty much, it wasn't really a very religious family, so I got half the story there. Right, I just got the work ethic, but there wasn't any heaven as a reward, let's say. Well, so the work was meaningless, and I felt
that's like, why they call it the Protestant work ethic.
Exactly. So it was missing. It was not a coherent unit anymore. There was just a practice, and so the social imaginary and culture, society at large. I mean, I think it is happening. If you go online and you look at young people and what they're saying now, they are really refusing to enter what I call in the essay the machine, right? That you're being entrained into the capitalist system. If you go join the workforce, you're asked to like leave your personality by the door. Chances of burnout because of this lack of meaning is really, really high. So that shaping of self, and I reference it also in the essay, this constant upgrading that is needed to kind of meet the demands of this system that you have to answer, but that does not provide any meaning. Yeah, it's breaking down, and people are on the move and are looking, and I mentioned them in the essay too, some of the counter reactions, the lying flat movement in China, in the East. I think the Great Resignation in the United States is what they call it there. People are just they experience more meaning and happiness, living in their car, not being able to pay their mortgages and rent, rather than just participating in a system that doesn't give a one iota about their subjectivity and their capacity and willingness for care for the whole. So I see it destabilizing. I really do, and I think there may be a moment of waking up. Maybe AI is actually going to push that over the edge, when there's huge technological unemployment, for example. That's what I would say.
I'm putting that on the AI thing on the back burner. I'm going to punt. I know we'll get back to it, but I see some questions coming up on the social imaginary, and you and I both knew we had to talk about this because there are different levels, right? So,
Yeah.
so the ones that I think you and I are trying to excavate are the ones that are deeper than the others. Like, for example, it's pretty common for people that we hang out with, or a lot of people, to debunk capitalism, to criticize capitalism, to understand that it's everywhere, that it's a limiting constraint, that it's got its fingers in everything. So on a intellectual level, and people understand that. And so we could say, I know Thomas Bjorkman says this, you know, capitalism is a social imaginary and oxygen is not. But sometimes people think we can get away without having, you know, oxygen, but we have to have capitalism. So we certainly, and so what we're talking about as a social imaginary is deeper than capitalism. Capitalism is what we call a shared action protocol. And we're limited to the shared action protocol, and we could talk about this later. Why? And you wrote this in your essay. It's actually a quote from a comment by one of the pop-up students, Shayla Wright.
Yeah.
And you talk about the production of subjectivity. So let me just give the audience an example. So in the pop-up school, and I know you saw this, was everybody in the pop-up school could critique capitalism, some at a very, very high level of the generative functions and the history and the complexity. But when you do a simple exercise, you find that your knee-jerk response to the exercise has a certain kind of subjectivity that is capitalist in nature. That you feel that this situation, I'm all of a sudden in a lose-lose situation, or I'm all of a sudden in a rivalrous economy. And so what we are talking about social imaginary is more like what Shayla called, what we call in pop-up school, the production of a certain kind of subjectivity. And so where even if you had a different kind of currency, this is the problem with the NFTs. I mean, in a lot of the blockchain DAOs is that it's a different kind of currency, is a different type of trust situation, but at the core of it is a speculative market. And the way people respond to a speculative market is the same way every bona fide capitalist responds to it. Push the value up and get out as fast as possible. Like, where do the assets go? It goes, so what do you, like, talk about those deeper, what's in the deeper fundamental parts of the social imaginary that we actually, you know, if 500 books have been written about it, it's not deep enough, right?
Yeah, here I've kind of tried to do my own take on how that subjectivity gets structured in the essay. And one of the ways that I analyzed it was by using the notion of the imaginal qualia, I call them. You know, I see these as social axioms. They are big societal commitments, collective agreements that really form the edge of our imagination. And by that I mean, without these things, like a big notion is progress or development, you know, we don't really know who we are, or it doesn't inform the meaningfulness of our practices. And so those are a couple of big ones. But coming back to like the whole monetary thing, I would then say something like being transactional, right? Like I have a sense of my self-worth because I went to school, I have skills, I have something to offer is my view. And if I do that well, I expect to get something back. You know, I give, I take, but that is now kind of implicit in the way I communicate or that I do work, for example. But with that, how successful I am with that, and success is another one of these qualia that we just pursue, right? That we use as a set of action protocols, let's say, to optimize for this. And so that is again like a way that we're not questioning. Usually, we're just engaging in this. This is again something that is just as knee-jerk in our minds. Reciprocity here. And of course it has a deep evolutionary history too, but this culture kind of puts that on steroids, and through what you pointed out earlier, these win-lose dynamics, it's game theory, scarcity mindset. So that unquestioning of these big imaginal qualia is something that I think we should be looking at, and how these all work together, because they are attractors. They make sure that different cultures can also interoperate. I mean, if I speak capitalism, let's say, then I can just walk into any boardroom in Japan and do business, right? It's like I've now become portable, and so yeah, it just eases interaction, but it's a very narrow set of action protocols, and it allows me to play the game rather than being authentic. It's to make a quick analogy and finish up is, I asked my parents, why'd you have kids? Why'd you have us? What they said, but just what you did, right? they never thought about it consciously. It's like, no, it's what you get married. That's just what you did. So it's that pre-reflexive layer. There's a threshold of reflexivity where, and hopefully here, because this would be the zone of praxis, is where we can kind of like dip into, and we can talk about this, because the processing of this, the automatic processing of the model, the internalized model that I have of being an individual, a rational individual that is optimizing for, I don't know, wealth accumulation, just to name one thing, that is what we can question. So having this kind of societal mindfulness, I would say, and that's why I want to make the social imaginary actually like salient, and that's why we're talking about this. So it becomes less of the pressure of us running on autopilot, because yeah, I think I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, so first for the audience, and then I'm going to turn this statement around. Yeah, my parents said the same thing. And in fact, now that my parents are too old. My father's dead, so he doesn't think about it much anymore. My mother's too old to think about it right now. But in the middle of their lives, early on, they would say, well, that's what we just did. And they lived enough into the modern world that then they could realize that that's weird, because by the time we were, young adults, they didn't want us just to do that. They wanted us to think about it. So they actually could reflect back about how weird it was that they just did that without thinking about it, So there's a kind of even they understood that it was weird. Like my mom understood, like she made these big, like she had 2 kids, and she met my father 6 months later. She was pregnant and married, and then and then she had another, and like life just happened to her, Now I just want to say something though. It doesn't mean that it was a worse life. This is extremely important for people to understand, that reflexivity itself comes with its own problems. So I just want to put that in, number one. But now I want to say that it's obvious to probably our audience that we wouldn't just let that kind of situation happen to us. Just get married and have kids. But there's many things that we just do. We may be 50, I'm too old, but 50 years down the line or 30 years down the line and say, well, why did you go to college? I don't know. That's just what people did. You see, there's many, many things that we do in our generation that are equally like surprising, that we just and that I think is what the social imaginary really is. It's the things you do that you just do. They have important ramifications and consequences, and you look back and you say, I don't know, why did people go to college? Of course, now people are starting to see, why do people just go to college? And so one of the questions that is interesting to ponder as a community, and this is the whole game of trying to think our way out of thinking the way we think, is that you always have to go deeper, oh, thank God we're out of just getting married and having kids and not thinking about it. But there's a level at which that's true for us too. And that's what we're trying to talk about. Like, why do you just start jumping on board the knowledge economy? Like, why is that? Like, why do you just, they invent this thing where you, this interesting question. So the whole nature of retail and consumerism's changed, right? So, I mean, not for me, I don't understand. It seems odd for me, but I started to see a switch where people were not buying groceries. They were just buying these like packages that had like the recipe and the exact amount of things so every night you come home and you open up your meal and you make it and you become part of a club. It's extremely expensive, right? And I'm like, why are you doing that? And it's like, well, this is just what everybody does. Like, this is the sense that we get on board because this is progress. Like, why do people fly? Like, it's ridiculous how much people fly all over the world to do vacations and these meetings and these why do we do these things? Like we're not really caught. We do it because the airlines and the whole airline industry advertises that this is what someone at your education level and your age and your talent should do. And that's why we do it. So I think it'd be interesting to, maybe not in this conversation, but just to show that what we're talking about is stuff that constantly gets away from our own examination.
It does, and often it's also because we don't really get offered alternatives, right? I mean, everybody, some of you may know this influential essay by Francis Fukuyama that he wrote, The End of History. That was when the communist imaginary, in some sense, like fell away, had lost, and so we wound up with a monoculture. So there wasn't any kind of competing way for a while. At least that was what we were told. Thatcherism also had this beautiful TINA acronym. There is no alternative, right? Like, it became more and more monocultural, and this was the only way to run the world. And I quote, it's a well-worn quote that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But that speaks to the constraints around our imagination. And coming back to your question, like, what can we do? What can we practice here? It's not just go and sit like, let's imagine a better world and have, hanging gardens of shiny skyscrapers now, because that's the future that we're going to have, like solar punk futures or something like that. But and I really want to kind of like investigate the temporics of this change, because what we're talking about here is usually very slow, right? Like, at some point, it was very normal in societies and Western societies to still hold slaves, and all of a sudden it was like, oh, wait a minute, this is like really weird. No one would advocate to go back to that or say like, voting rights for women. At some point, this was just like not done, and then all of a sudden it's okay. And so if I see the Overton window of the imagination, right, like that is kind of, if we see that these imaginal qualia are the constraints, the borders, the horizon of our experience, collective experience, let's say, then yeah, you see things happening at the edges, like now giving rights, for example, to non-human persons like dolphins, larger primates, and now we come up with all kinds of rationales for that, like they have to have some kind of self-consciousnesses, and yes, gorillas, not cats, and so this is kind of the frothy edge of that.
Cats.
They've done all these tests, like, and dogs even, like, I'm probably offending people, dog owners here, but like even dogs fail these kind of like self-consciousness tests repeatedly, and cats do too, and yeah, some other animals, they do pass them. So here again, it depends on, like, okay, so how do we come up with these metrics? How do we let not cats pass the tests, and then okay, dolphins, yeah, you passed. it's oddly arbitrary to some extent, but but to finish off here, an imaginary, and I quote this, also determines what for a society at any given time is real. Just the notion of what is real. And if you ask Descartes, then a dog was a machine, right? Like, didn't have an interior. So now we don't think that at all. It's like, oh no. I mean, even though we can't be sure, but we have a theory of mind. We've moved beyond it. We have a deeper interiority that we like extend, and yeah, and so that helps shift the imaginary. But I hope it can just go a little bit quicker, and that is partly why I'm, for example, introducing the essay the notion of time and temporics, because the way history gets carried over into the present moment, the weight of the past, these are some notions that I think we should be really looking at, especially now that technology is capturing data, and the data sets that we are amassing, and we are being held up a mirror. This is coming back to solipsism. This is constantly being reflected back to ourselves. It's being rehashed, and the behavioral incentives, like the incentives to manipulate our behavior, of course, are just so big now. Social media does that. We know that the algorithms optimize for certain kind of things. So our collective salience landscape, and this is another term that I see the imaginary as being, where are we looking collectively? What are we caring about? All those things are being determined, and especially now that technology is gaining so much influence on it, and you could argue it has its own logos, it has its own kind of imagination, and how that interfaces with our culture, and yeah, so our evolutionary cues, the information we get from the outside world, that is highly curated and mediated, and we don't have enough say in it yet. It's just technology companies can do whatever they want, basically, and without very little eye for the negative externalities and the effects on culture. I mean, how did Facebook manage, like, how long do we have it? 15 years? How did they manage to wreck democracy? Did anybody see that one coming? Right? Anyway, so yeah, here's where I become a bit of a curmudgeon. Sorry.
I think that what I'm hearing in this, which is kind of fascinating in terms of a knot, and I was going to go to solipsism too, and that is, it's a cognitive knot in a way, and that is that so you talk about solipsistic society, and you say solipsism is not like narcissism, right? Because you could you can be solipsistic and just pay attention, tend to your own thoughts and your own feedback loops, and actually keep being a profound critic of yourself. So solipsism is just that you're caught, I call it locked in syndrome. You're just caught in your own imaginary perception, imaginary worries, and imaginary, and then you try to figure out what to do next by trying to figure it out. I once worked with a young man from Germany who was a philosophy student, PhD student, and he also had one of these early childhood experiences of looking at his parents, and like he couldn't understand why his mom would say she was happy when she wasn't, and then he had this whole theory that his parents were always lying to him, which made him very conspiratorial, on and on. But he was caught in this loop, because he was like, how can I make a moral act if I don't have a definition of morality? So this is like hyper self-reflective, hollow mirrors. So that's solipsism, that you're stuck inside your own experience, your own interiority. So in a sense, yeah, that's great that we have interiors, but then if you're stuck inside of your own interiority, then you think that's real, right? Because this is like you said, this is one way to. So we have the hyper psychologizing everything. We have people doing meditation badly and examining phenomenology that's already objects in their mind, and being surprised that they're empty, but they're already object, and so there's all this is withdrawal into one's mental space and interiority. So that's one part of it. And I think it's part of also the stuckness, because there's this sense that there has to be a complete decision point that's in your head, or in your, know your purpose and all this stuff, before you make an act. And so people just withdraw from action in the world. And even this notion of be in right relationship, be in right action. Well, then that just makes people think, well, I don't know what that means. So now I got to figure out what it means before I can do something. So there's this solipsistic cycle that I think is related to the stuckness. That's one thing. But my question is, like, we're on the one hand inside our own heads, and we don't want to be like if you're trying to crack through the social imaginary, that makes you feel like, we have this word individuated, that makes you feel like you're becoming more of an individual. But then we also want to be more and more collective. So what is the tension there? Like, do we have to become islands before then we can reshape the collective we want to draw? Or like, if we're just all collective, it's very nice to have, then we're just in mass consciousness. So what's the relationship there? Where do you go with that kind of?
Yeah, that's another question, of course, that is a big one, and many answers have been given. I do see that some of the thinkers on the imaginary work with this, like Castoriadis is one, who looks at the tension between this pressure of enculturation and the freedom of the individual. Some try to solve that by trying to make, like, all these images that come up and that we actually also regurgitate, right? Like in the solipsistic kind of dynamic, they try to reinvent this notion of the imaginal. So as a zone where we are not experiencing ourselves as like the finished product, like a fixed identity, clear-cut, definitions about what reality is, often through the lens of dualism, self-other. So again, here, if you develop a somatic literacy, and it's possible to kind of go back into yourself and come to that place where things are still not completely split, let's say. And I think this holds the potential if you want to kind of like, okay, how do we work with this? Participation is a big term now these days, and I talk about it also as entanglement, right? So internalizing that and having access to that process where there is no hard subject-object divide. These are just like a practice that you can do. And in cultural history, things weren't as clear cut as they are now. Gebser, we haven't mentioned his name yet, but he goes through this whole the psychocultural history and different structures of consciousness that he has mapped out at the hand of various artifacts. And he makes this point. He says, like, for example, in the Latin language, like the word alto means both up and down. It's like high and low. For us moderns, like that are in like a real rational kind of binary in which we are at home, that is unacceptable almost. And there are more examples of this. So I do think that is workable from a deepened sense of embodiment, where the unconscious end result, the end product is not like the highly differentiated self. You can still access that. The perspective is still available, but it doesn't mean you have to always hang out there. That is the autopilot again. So these are some of the ways that I believe that we can start to work with that. And I mean, you and I, we know people who are also working with this intersubjective, sometimes we call it the field. Sometimes we assign it like a real ontological reality, right? Believe that or not, that doesn't really matter. But so this dance, and I think also this is basically the point where humans now are, in their history, in their evolutionary history. We don't really know how to do that yet, and to maintain a critical subjectivity while staying in connection and actually sharing a boundary. I think that is a really important concept, and one, sharing the boundary, for example, of the imaginary with the natural world. We can talk about here how the economic system interfaces with the natural world, right? It's lost the sharing of the boundary because we've also not really, we're not handling real matter anymore. It's all what Bifo, Berardi, I quoted him in the article. He calls it semio-capitalism. It's all cognitive labor, right? We manipulate the memes, and that is now what much of our economy drives on and what sells things. But material production is kind of like is away from many people in the West. I mean, I worked in a factory. I've handled steel when I was building greenhouses. It gives you a bit of a different interfacing, but. Yeah, the hall of mirrors of culture, of all the stuff that is being thrown at us. I do think you need to unplug to some extent, because otherwise you're just caught in it. And it's good for business, but it's bad for your mind. We know that because it destroys connection. And what do we wind up seeking? What really pays? Yeah, if companies can sell you dopamine shots that give you fake connection via their products. So yeah, a bit of a winding rant there, but I hope that starts to answer some of your questions.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So one of the things I heard was, I mean, basically, if you want to talk about social imaginaries, basically, we've been sold the story, as Charles Eisenstein liked to say, of separation, that we're separate. And then what happens is, and then we've been told that because we're separate, we have to become a we space. We have to become a collective. And so then everybody's trying to become a collective because they don't think that they're connected. There's no deep, the basic assumption is that there exists no deep continuity between people, between mind and body, between individuals and the collective, and between humans and nature.
Yeah.
We operate. And so this is where it gets tricky, because you may spend your whole life advocating for collective socialness, being a collective or a we space, but all that work exposes the fact that you think that's not already a prior given. You can't but possibly be, life is continuous with life. There is no separation. As an individual, you individuate, you become unique along the human line. There's parts of my experience that I can't ever share with you. I can only bridge so much. And so but that doesn't make me nervous, because at a deeper level, we're exactly the same. And at a deeper level, we share our animal bodies with animals, and then we share the life force with the life force. There's the call to do something to make the system whole is an instance of bad faith. It's predicated on you thinking it's not whole in the first place. And this is what I call the shadow of post-war humanism. And so it leads to globalization. Everything is now under only so many languages, 200 nations, one financial system with the exception of North Korea and Iran, and now maybe that'll be broken up. But the whole movement toward mass consciousness and mass globalization, the whole conversation around values, everyone has to have shared values. And this is all only made possible because people have lost faith that we're already connected in the deeper universals. So this is something Indigenous knows. And this then goes exactly to what you said that term was about this dimension. We've been sold that the sacred is a vertical dimension, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Now, vertical means it goes like this. Horizontal means it goes like this. But our whole relationship to the sacred is not deep continuity, it's transcendent. It's as if we said the horizontal is only left, right? And the whole way we talk about the vertical, it's only up. And if it's from, I don't know, here, maybe my heart and up, then of course I feel separate. I hope the audience understands that the whole way we talk about the vertical dimension is it's from here up. Vertical has come to mean up. That's like saying horizontal has come to mean left. And so these are the kinds of deep structural imaginaries that have wounded us, that create actions that are in the wrong direction, even though we experience it as good or spiritual. Let's all become one. Let's have a we space. It's not possible that we don't have a we space. It's not possible. Now, we may not have the ideological version of we space, but it's not possible to not be a we. And so yeah. And so this, you spend quite a lot of time on this deep continuity, and I think that's where it happens. So I just see this chat, but the narcissistic ego is itself a social imaginary of the modern Western world.
Yeah,
it's a construct that that's imagined into your reality. I know exactly how this happens psychologically in the Western world. And so this is the depths by which we need. And so what's the choice? The only choice, the only way out of this pickle is to act. Because nature, the real, like you call it the revenge of the real, nature, the hunk of steel, the plant unplanted, nature doesn't give a shit about what you imagine it is. It's got its own stubborn reality. So to really get out of the social imaginaries, you have to establish action protocols where you put things into action, and then you notice what is the response of the world to that action. And you have to try to do that in a completely naive way, right? So what if instead of being nervous that I don't have a professional job, what if I don't get a professional job? What if I not blindly get a low-paying job, but get a low-paying job, and then notice that makes me tense because I feel like a loser? Well, I've been running around saying I don't think poor people are losers, but why do I feel like a loser if I'm not making money? This is interesting. But you see, I set the question in an action protocol. And so when I hear your story of your initiation, I see that people are lucky that life throws them curveballs, because you can't rely on analysis. You're forced to study with the world, through the world. and it doesn't really care what you imagine it is. And so this is obviously time in between worlds. If we had a functioning social imaginary, then yeah, maybe the work isn't so hard. But we basically, our whole society lives in an imaginary reality. And so the kind of social imaginaries, it's like Graeber's book, The Dawn of Everything, you know. There's no way out. You can't walk out of your society and start over. It's very hard to walk out of this social imaginary. Anyways, that's the top of the hour. Do you want to say maybe wrap that up, or you start another line of inquiry?
Yeah, we can. I mean, from here, yeah, there's so many ways we can go. I mean, you touch upon like the spiritual, the vertical, up and out, you know, as a means of escape, because I do think like many people are under stress and seeking that. I mean, I describe this in the essay, my spiritual bypassing, as it's sometimes called. And I think we're doing this on a collective level is always to seek transcendence, right? It's like, oh, I'm being challenged by the complexity and this society that seems to be accelerating, and I can't keep up. It's so funny. I go on Twitter and I see these AI bros now saying like, you gotta get in on this newest AI because, you know, you're gonna lag behind. And I mean, that whole dynamic is just already so self-defeating. But as you say, you know, dropping out is also problematic, of course, right? Because as you say, yeah, you take these actions, but the notions of success, self-esteem, status, etc., that is kind of what you have to live for a while. And it's liminal. You know, I like this notion of liminal living. Zach Stein also makes this point that the time in between worlds is, you know, the liminal is the workspace for people like us, designers. What are we inviting people in? Outgrowing an imaginary. Well, I had to, you know, in my younger years when I didn't have tools and I wasn't as resilient, I had to struggle with nihilism quite a bit. You know, where do I find meaning? It's all, I had no idea. So it comes at a cost. I do think that practicing for its own sake, for example, because we're highly input-output, you know, mostly focused on output. This is another one of these, what I call modern mental malware that we project into the future, idealized future, and it's all strategy. We forget we are in the now. We forget the work, what Dave Snowden calls the evolutionary potential of the present moment, right here and now, both in our bodies, training the body mind that can actually perceive that and work with that. You know, that's very important. And hopefully what we can start to teach, like the full spectrum perception of different centers of perception, heart, head, belly, etc. You know, they give you some way of traversing this liminal space, and give you some handle on seeing the deeper continuity. You know, and if you take that as a practice, that can go all the way to what is sometimes called non-duality. You know, some spiritual traditions talk about this, but I do believe that if you want to, coming back to your point, if you want to not bring the past into the next iteration, you kind of have to go through there, because otherwise the malware, you know, from the old system, and not everything is bad, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to like throw it away wholesale, not at all. You know, psychologically it's healthy to have teleologies like, oh, it's going somewhere, right? If it's hard for collectives and humans to not have a temporally extended self, as they say. It's a marker of health to be able to do that, to set goals. It gives meaning. It's what we do. So, but yeah, we have no choice, I think, but to learn to live liminally and flow with flow. You know, collective way. I mean, you're a Taoist, Bonnie, so you know you love this notion. And just to round off here, and after that we can maybe open it up. Like I talk about logos in the end, and I feel a bit ambivalent about the languaging here because it's been used in so many, it's resurfacing in so many ways. But what I basically mean by that is we can tap into the intelligence of unfoldment there are ways to surrender. It becomes more about like classical fruits of the spirit, as they sometimes are called in spiritual tradition: trust, courage, forbearance, joy of discovery, but practice for its own sake and not just always wanting to know the outcome. That is preset. We got to stop doing that. Predict, control. It's good for some contexts, but it can also really be malware, and it just keeps us stuck in the same direction. So hard to unlearn, very, very hard to unlearn. Okay, I'll leave it there. Is this a good point to open it up for Q&A?
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to open it up, and now you got me going again, but I'm going to resist.
Yeah.
So we didn't talk about this beforehand. I guess Lee's going to come back in and try to serve questions. Yeah.
Thank you both. That was really I think it brought up a lot of new things actually for me that I hadn't necessarily gotten to in just the reading. So the point of this, and especially I think you guys didn't have a chance to be reading while you were speaking, but the chat will be saved and I'll send it to both of you so you can get a sense of what some of the noticings that were happening. There were a lot of interesting ones there. I won't go too much into it because I want to give more chance to different people to say their questions out loud. There was one that sort of linked to some of the last points that you were talking about in terms of action. So I was wondering if Claudia Gonella, you might be willing to read your question out loud. You don't have your camera on, but if I unmute you, I might ask you to ask your question. She was asking about sort of what is Ivo doing to actively create or discover the social imaginary that he would like to live into? And also sort of some questions about working to be whole. So I might just invite Claudia to ask that if she's still here. Claudia, can you?
Yes, I am here. Thanks, Lee.
Perfect. Okay, wonderful.
Yeah, I was just, I think this question came up when you were talking about all the kind of self-improvement that you were doing. I think I labeled it as self-improvement because I see that very much in my own trajectory. So that might be a bit of projection. But I wondered also about the link between social imaginary and identity. So, and it came up, or subjectivity. And I just wondered, are you in this later stage of your journey kind of actively trying to, sort of live into a social imaginary that you've identified as being wise or whatever? Or are you finding that your identity changes as you practice and then you find yourself in a new social imaginary? I think it's kind of it feels a bit old now, that question, because I completely resonate with what Bonnitta is saying, is that, the practice needs to be kind of action in the world rather than just practice in our own minds. So, maybe extend that question to, are you acting in a way in the world that is living into a new social imaginary, and what does that mean for your identity? I guess I want to know is how do you identify right now? Who are you now, Ivo?
Yeah, thanks for that, Claudia. It's a good question. I would say the answer is as of yet no. I think I am still very much in the process of unlearning. And I think I can't just by myself live into a new social imaginary, because it's by its very nature, it's a collective phenomenon. So what I try to do is and I get to the identity part later, but in the course design, we do see this a structure, we call it Realization 101. We hope to launch it later this year. But where we go through a 3-part process, and one is really getting, where are we now? Basically the sense-making part, to get people to have a good sense of like what the imaginary is that they are living in. And then the second part will be the unlearning part, I would say. You could say unlearning modernity, like the way we have internalized the model, let's say. We reference Shaila, before, and how she experienced like a fairly rapid deconstruction of this internalized model that, you know, shaped her subjectivity and worldview. And so I think we need to go through that first. You know, this is practice. It's fun too. Not easy necessarily. And I think only then can we start to weave. Once we've learned to live liminally, and I love this notion that Bonnie actually came up with once in one of her essays, to become extemporaneans. And I have an analogous notion, and I call it singularitarians. And you know, we got to create islands, micro imaginaries first. You know, little groups of people who just start to weave and come from a different set of axioms and a different kind of subjectivity that can do that and can hold the space and can start to create a different constellation of self, other, and world. And finally, to your identity point, it's reflexive, and by that I mean in the anthropologist sense, it's like you affect that which you are observing. So you, and here entanglement comes back in. So you can't just create something out there. You know, that which you change, changes you. Everything you touch will change you. And so we have to learn that. And we need ecologies of practices for that. We need to have a really solid grasp of social ontology and the understanding of 4E neuroscience. This is all new, right? It's like how our cognition is embedded, extended, embodied, and enacted. I think you can add more E's if you want. But once we see that in action, and Bonnitta calls this the metaphysical operating system of our mind, you know, or the metaphysical operating system of our being that creates the constellation of self, other, and world. Yeah, then we can start this. Then we can start to do this, and to round it off, to make that coherent. And this is why I want to stress the notion of logos. Again, like still kind of trying to language this differently, but a logos is that which makes it coherent. You can't just have annual practices and do that. And here it is both something that is top down and bottom up, and it has to meet and mingle. You know, practices make a logos coherent, and a logos make practices coherent. This is again a non-dual, entangled, interpenetrating kind of affair. So yeah, identity will be very different. I see it already changing in society, because I believe this is a hallmark of acceleration and social change, that people are so like constantly in a place of who am I? The world is changing so fast, especially when you're young, that we now see, screw it, I'm non-binary. You know, like they use notions like that. It's almost like if you know anything about quantum computing, it's like putting yourself in a superposition. I'm not a 1, I'm not a 0. You know, I want to stay in potential. I want to not be entrained by the system. I want to have the fluidity. I don't want to have rigid identities. So identity too is becoming fluid. And I believe this is where we're going, you know, like living process and being able to do that. So it's actually a really good hack, all this this playing around with identity, although I don't think we should be staying there. And yeah. That's enough, I think. We can talk about identity and time, because these are very, very strongly related. Without identity in the non-dual sense, there's also no time. We haven't touched upon that point of temporics. Read the essay to get a good start on it, and Gabzer is even better to get into that. And well, there's more, but Bonnitta, you want to kind of come in here?
So I think we're kind of veered off of the question, so I'm just going to riff. I think you answered the question and then moved on, but I think that for me, if I was asked it, so I've been running experiments like this for a long time, and that is, some of you have heard me talk about like noticing how whenever I notice that I can't think outside of a certain construction. So one construction is we have this construction of the individual and the collective, and I can't, and every time I use that construction, it's not really useful. So then I think, well, I don't want to ask myself questions like that anymore. Or one of the things I noticed through gardening is that the language of complex adaptation in the environment was problematic, because it leads to you spray pesticides on the pest, and then they adapt to that, and then you adapt to that. And I was realizing that this is deep in our social imaginary, that we have basically one primary theory of large system scale, and that's complex adaptive systems, and everything's adapted under adaptive pressure to everything else. So when something like that comes up, I'm like, okay, well, I don't want to interpret anything that I perceive in my garden like that. And for a while, it's weird. Like, you don't have anything else to put in its place. And you notice that, like Ivo said, that the mind wants to predict, the mind wants to understand, the mind wants to see patterns. And then this is, and out of this experiment came, which we're working on, is this notion of complex potential states. Why isn't, and it's very Whiteheadian, it has a lot of grounding in established philosophy, it's speculative philosophy, but so is complex adaptive systems thinking. It's not in the world, it's a social imaginary. And when you use it, it produces certain action protocols and not others. And so if we have a different, so then you can play with a different one. Another one is that very early on, we have a sense-making crisis. And if you watched my Hollow, I would say, well, that the world should make sense in a certain way is itself a social imaginary. When we were evolving as late stage primates and early stage humans, the world did not make sense in this way. The world only makes sense in this way to Western American and Europeans after World War II. You think the world in World War II made sense in the way we think the world should make sense? No, this is a very short period of time where we start to think, oh, okay, we're sense makers. The world makes sense to us. Again, another constraining social imaginary. And yet the whole liminal web is on like a sense-making kit. But the fact that we think the world should make sense in this way is itself very modern, very recent, very conditioned. And then Ivo said, like, 4E cognition, many people understand 4E cognition, but nobody takes it seriously, because 4E cognition says you can't think your way to the next right step. You have to enact it. And people go blah, 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 and they'll say that, but then they live in intellectual and conceptual lives, and they don't take any action. So there's a lot of things we can take seriously. We can take seriously the theory of complex potential states. Ivo and I are working on a theory of action potentials that will help us really believe the deep continuity of life in mind and humans in nature. And so part of this is a lot of these ideas are already very well worked out, but we don't take them seriously. And what do I mean by seriously? We don't say, yes, that's true, and so I'm going to act that way, because nobody else is. And then we don't, without that decision point to engage the world in what you take seriously, you're just lost. You'll never get out of it. It's just solipsistic.
Okay. We've got a lot of questions, so I'm just like aware of the fact that we don't have a lot of time left. So I'm wondering, there are actually two questions, one from Pat Kane, another from Eric Lilius, fairly recently put into the chat. And they're both sort of a, can you elaborate upon this, or can you explain a little bit more what you mean by this? And so I might just ask if you could respond to those fairly briefly, and then, but I do think that one of them might actually lead into a little bit longer of a conversation about entanglement. So I'm wondering actually, Pat, if you could ask yours first. It's basically, he wants to know what the subject is. Pat still here? I was just trying to see, actually going through the long list here. Pat, if you just ask your question briefly, and hopefully that'll help get things started.
Sure. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Hi, Ivo. Very interesting, wonderful pamphlet. But you introduced this concept towards the end of subject matter, where you run the, I think you run the two words together, and I think you're mentioning it in the idea, in the context of what resources can we draw on to shape ourselves and shape our social imaginary in progressive emancipatory ways. But you try to sort of say we need, I don't know whether it's material resources or psychological resources or conceptual resources, but I like the idea of subject matter. You know, what can we think about what the critical theorists used to call subjectification? What are the things that we're not just the victims of other people's subjectification, but we are self-subjectifying, and that idea of, I think, self-consciously crafting a self, particularly in an AI age. Someone's wanting to ask you what your perspective is on AI, but the whole idea that you know, ourselves have a kind of, that what AI is questioning is the kind of machine-like nature of ourselves. And I'm interested in play, so I'm very interested in creative agency to defy the work ethic and to defy the Protestant legacy. But subject matter to me would be things like toys or tools, or a way of being in community in a carnivalesque kind of way. I mean, that's what I would think what subject matter is, and I'm looking for that subject matter. What's your definition of that? Give me instances of it would be really useful.
Yeah, this one still needs to develop. I kind of brought it in because it seemed to be like a really pragmatic move to also already start assigning interiority. You know, I was kind of thinking, oh, is this where I'm going to, you know, announce myself a panpsychist or something like that? But I think it's important that we do that, because again, it opens up imagination, and not just like an imagine in the future. No, like really the stuff right in front of you. You know, how is it combined? What kind of subjectivity would it have? That there are other, you know, streams that you're probably familiar with that try to kind of rethink our relationship to material reality, and I think that is actually really important. So not exactly always assigning an identity. I mean, in Japan, I learned from my wife that she lived there for 3 years. You know, objects have a kind of like a soul. They have a presence there, and so the relationship to them is very different. And I think we could definitely, as a first move, as a first step, we could start doing that already. You know, to establish a very different relationship to our wasteful culture. And let's see. But if we want to take that further, then in the school, I also practice in the diamond approach. We talk and encounter like what is called essential aspects, and they show up after we work through a certain kind of ego structure that is connected and covers over. Actually, it makes up for the loss of connection to that essential aspect, and these are will, power, peace, strength, joy. You know, you name them. Like again, here we can bring that further. And maybe you saw Zach Stein's conversation with Ian McGilchrist about valueception. You know, so here's where I'm going to. And you know, can we start to play with the idea that love, for example, is true? Does it have a real ontological, you know, substance? For example, you can really experience these things again in the body. You need a certain kind of depatterning and somatic literacy, but to me they're real. And to be able to do that, you need a certain kind of let's say like reality is responsive to your sincere inquiry. And you know, Werner Heisenberg has this beautiful quote. He says, what we're perceiving is not reality, but it's reality exposed to our method of questioning. And that is what I mean by it. You know, you can engage in that dialogue and find the subject matter there. It's both you and the matter and the subject matter that you're inquiring into, and it has real ontological substance. So I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ivo. That's actually really good, because I think this is sort of also part of what Eric was asking related to your ideas behind entanglement and what does it mean to be part of the problem. And you have a very specific way you talk about entanglement in the essay, and in a way you're trying to perhaps recuperate the word or use it in a slightly different way than how it's currently being thrown about, perhaps. So I wonder if, Eric, I'll just unmute you here and ask you to maybe read that quote. Are you able to unmute yourself, Eric? Would you like to ask a question, perhaps? Okay. Okay, it might not be working technically. Oh,
okay.
yeah. Okay, great.
Yes. I have been working with a book called Hospicing Modernity.
Oh yeah, yeah, I know it.
And one of the 4 denials, and the one that I've had to work with most deeply, is the denial of entanglement. So I was really interested in this quote where it says, well, the second part is, if it's familiar, once you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. Entanglement says, if you're not part of the problem, you can't be part of the solution. That made me laugh out loud, but I also, I could feel that was I was embodying that in a way that I really appreciate having to look at it from that point of view. Like, I view this culture as being built on the sort of the myth of separation. And to move out of that, out of what the author of Hospicing Modernity refers to as the house of modernity. So for me, this entanglement and being in the world and not feeling separate. I mean, I'm 75 years old and I am just working with this now. My culture did not tell me at any point that I was one with everything, that I was not separate. I mean, this whole, I see the embodied, or we'll call it the normalized violence in this culture is part of that sense of separation. So I'm wondering if you could just expand on that a little more.
Yeah, thanks for that question. As you say, yeah, I haven't really dug deep into the book yet, but I've looked at it, read it vertically, I think, and like causality, I actually use it in a fairly loose way. I realized in the article, it's part of, you know, there's a systems view where you are part of it, and you know, it's kind of still fairly. You can't be outside of the system. You're always in it, right? Like you can't act on it. It doesn't work that way. That's the logic of the separation. And many people that trying to affect change makers know this. And complex dynamic systems are very resilient. They will just kind of rejig and you know, you think you're actually doing something, but it doesn't work. And then there's the entanglement of that is much more along the quantum mechanics kind of way. That actually denies us, let's say, a prior status of being a separate kind of self, as we like ourselves to be. That there are separate objects and observers. In a quantum system, these are both, you know, they enact each other. So, you know, the relationship, as Bonnie already also pointed out before, the relationships are more primary rather than the relata. The finished, what we perceive as objects. And yeah, here again, like, I mean, this is all fun, like as cognitive candy, but the real challenge is to, like, how do we really work with that, right? What types of new agency does it afford us? that to me is the question. And coming back to the action protocols, you know, and what I shared before with Pat's question, how does our disposition, the mental models that we bring to our issues, what kind of reality does that yield? And I think this is where we have imaginal agency there. We have we can design our experiments. I think that is like a big part of our agency in working with that, and become, care, I would say, is the key word here. You know, how can we care for knowing of our entanglement, and knowing that it's fundamental, and knowing that these big lessons of quantum mechanics, for example, haven't yet made it into culture. Again, we know all this. We already almost know it now for like how long? 100 years, and it just doesn't seem to land. It's really frustrating. It's so I'll leave it there, I think, because I hear myself ranting now. But did you want to weigh in on that, Bonnie? I know you have a lot to say on this.
Yeah, it's another great question. I've got dogs, sorry. So I'm going to tie it into the previous question, and that is this word subject. And it's very close to where you're going with the word subject matter. And that is, we're always subject, everything we're subject of, or, you know, so I'm the subject, I pick up this pen, I'm the subject, it's the object. I'm also subject to it, subjected to it. And that's a kind of entanglement. It's in both directions at the same time. And what's important to understand about that is that it's not only the subject that I'm subject of that has agency. I'm also subject to the agency of the pen. Where's the agency in the pen and its design and what ink does and its characteristics and all this stuff. And so entanglement means whenever you're thinking of a situation, you have to prevent yourself from de-animating part of the equation, whether that's the desk or the molecules or the atom. And this move is a move of separation. So where we tend to think that here's a body and it is the object of which the mind moves it. So you're de-animating the body because the mind moves it, right? And what we need to say, no, it's entangled, that the body, you know, the mind is subject of and subjected to the body. The arm moving, it's not like there's really two things. The arm moving are those two things simultaneously, and the mind is looking at it from two different directions. And so that's what we mean by entanglement. That's one of the ways we mean by entanglement. And as Ivo said, it's very important to understand entanglement and not de-animate agency in the system. It actually makes you have to do the opposite move. Everything's entangled and everything has agency. And so a lot of people use that term entanglement. It makes you feel like, wow, you know, what am I? What does it matter what I'm doing? It's just an action reaction cycle. So that's one thing. And so then there's the big question that comes up it's you know, outside the scope of this conversation. It's something that Ivo and I talk about a lot, and that is, what is the nature of causality in this entangled world where everything has agency? Agency is multiple directionality. It's not Newtonian billiard ball, bang and go type of agency. Yeah. It's not a force moving an object. All the matter, every entity is self-animated. And so we call it the causal manifold in the school, and there are esoteric wisdom practices that let you get get a whiff of this deeper causal structure in an entangled world. But yeah, so that's part of the work.
I'm aware of the fact that we're at an hour and a half right now, and I think we had said we'd try to keep it around 90 minutes or so. So we could do one more question if you feel up for it. Otherwise, we can sort of bring it to a sort of natural ending, depending on how you guys feel. So I'll just leave that up to you if you feel up for another one.
Yeah, I'm okay. Yeah, for sure. I don't have a hard stop. So.
Okay, great.
One more.
There's sort of two things, and I'm actually, one of them is actually Indra had these great questions throughout related to public and private imaginaries, social imaginaries contrasted between public and private. But because Indra is part of Perspectiva, I'm actually going to ask her to hold on to that, and we can maybe bring it to another event with Ivo. We're going to hold on to that for the next one, but it's something that I'd like us to think about in future. But I'd like Olga to ask her question, because she had this really interesting question a bit of a while ago now that elicited some interest as well in the chat. So Olga, if you'd like to ask.
Hi, I'm sorry for my voice. I have a cold. Yeah, so I have this sort of running question in general. Like, I think, I don't know, I think Bonnie first mentioned this notion of oneness and how we're not separate from each other. And like, I kind of really like this, I believe in this personally speaking somehow, like I just sort of like that. And I think I know what this means in a way, although I'm not necessarily always acting on it. But like, my question was really like, if we all start believing this notion of non-separation, like really believe it to our bones, and we have a new social imaginary that maybe is based on that. And what does that look like? And I think a lot of the spiritual traditions and the religions and even some of the philosophies, they really point to this oneness, Stoicism, whatever, like a lot of them. And I'm really wondering what happens to a species if we all start operating like this, because I think a lot of the things we do, even like procreating, like having children, or like having medicine and trying to avoid our own death of the body, like almost all of the creative drive, even, or a lot of it, is like sort of motivated by this longing and this sort of like drive to like, you know, I need to cope with my sense of, even false sense of separation, but like I cope with it through creation or whatever. But like, so what does this look like? Like, I mean, I know it sounds maybe bad, but like part of me thinks that a lot of like the spiritual traditions are maybe studies on death, or maybe the new spiritual imaginary could be one where like maybe death is more accepted and maybe even revered in a, not in a, like, you know, creepy way, but like whatever. But like, I'm just curious, because like, isn't part of the separation what drives life in a way? And I'm just, I don't know, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. So this is something that's like.
You
want to go?
Yeah, because Olga, in your question, you had all the answers, which is really remarkable. So the problem is we use this term oneness, and just reflect on what kind of mental model you have. It might be a sphere or something, or it might be a pyramid or whatever. But oneness doesn't mean one agglutinized whole, because we live in a dynamic process universe. It moves through time and space. So you have to move to the notion of oneness as a genealogy unfolding in time. And now you can get to really cool thought experiments. So for example, if you have an amoeba, you know what an amoeba is? Like a one-celled animal. Yeah. And the way it procreates, doesn't procreate, it divides into two, and then into two into the four. Now, what if I asked you, is the first amoeba still around?
Yeah, Theseus.
Yeah, it's a kind of oneness. It's a kind of oneness, right? It's a kind of oneness, but it also unfolds as differentiation, but it's
Right.
a kind of oneness. Now, did you watch that great movie, My Octopus Teacher?
No.
Okay, so when the octopus gets pregnant and she composts, she metabolizes her own body in order to have babies. And I would ask you, is that first octopus still around? Well, it depends upon how you describe time and space, as separate or continuous. And so the problem that the traditions have is that they have a mental model of oneness that's kind of static, the Godhead, a glutenized whole. And then we say, but that's not what life is like, because you need a more sophisticated mental model or metaphysical understanding of oneness. Oneness through a genealogical unfolding is the real oneness. But it's that kind of oneness that all the amoeba are still one. And then you can get even creepier. Well, the octopuses are still one. And then you said the beautiful thing. It's like we even have babies and stuff. But it is a kind of oneness. And that's the kind of oneness that you can say unity and diversity, you can say all these words, but you have to feel into what kind of oneness these instances are, because that's the kind of oneness that's guaranteed for you. Now, your modern mind will then say, but that's not oneness, because you've been sold a static, reified notion of oneness, and we've been taken out of the flux and flow of the life force, where we can witness that, and it doesn't break our concept of oneness. That's the primary separation of the modern world. So this is like the work that we do in the courses is your instincts were right on, but it wasn't ever reflected back to you in the way that it's unfolding in your imagination, really.
I have to think about that. Thank you.
Yeah, a few things came up for me thinking about this. You asked, what would that look like? Well, I would hopefully see more care, and especially like, hopefully, this I see is like one of the biggest pieces of malware that we really need to get rid of. It's like our anthropocentrism, because if you look at this, it's called Luca. It's like I don't know what the U stands for actually, but the last known common ancestor, something like that. And it's kind of like the genealogy takes it all the way back. Like, really, we are one here. This is a very this is a biological story, and humanity will just have to take that insult that we're not as special as we like to think we are, as we've been told, right? The pinnacle of creation, in some sense, as the let's say the religious stories go. And anyway, so yeah, I think that would really start to help move us towards a healthier relationship with the natural world, and for one, and on a more yeah, since you mentioned spirituality, I make a distinction between unity and oneness. Oneness, in my understanding, is also it's all made out of one stuff. That's a perception that you can have. Like it takes different shape, but it's like really you perceive it as just one stuff. And the other is the unity perspective, which is just the whole world is there with all its objects, but there is just no separation. So that brings in the possibility for integration too. So like wholes can start to look different, collectives can start to look different, if there is again this understanding of the deep continuity of both oneness, biological, but also phenomenological and ontological, unity. And because Bonnitta and I are like also working with this notion of individuation. Simondon calls it like that. There's this drive, this push that differentiates, and the process of how the world comes into being. So here again, it gets a bit more esoteric, but very useful again to in practice terms. So I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome.
Okay, that's really great. I think that it's just probably a good point to end. We're at the 100-minute or 113-minute mark, perhaps, which is, we're trying to keep perspective events in that 100-minute. So I think we did a good job of that tonight. But mostly just really, really glad we got to hear both of you speak. And again, I think it's worth going through the essay on your own, and maybe going back based on some of the reflections and the discussions that we've had tonight. And we'll be making more announcements about other upcoming essays that will be published. And also we're going to have another video next week that will most likely just be a conversation pre-recorded between Ivo and I that we're doing, that will take a slightly different tack than the one tonight. I also wanted to quickly mention, I'll put it into the chat before we leave tonight, for the event that we're having next Wednesday with Isabella Granich, who's on this call right now, and she'll be in conversation with Ian McGilchrist as part of the Attention is a Moral Act series. So that's next Wednesday. You're welcome to join us for that. And thank you to everyone. I will be sending the chat to Bonnitta and Ivo so that they have a chance to read through some more of the questions that we didn't get a chance to answer tonight. But I think I will leave it at that. And thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Liam. Thank you, Bonnie. Bye, everyone.